I'm going to pick up where Greg left off on page 2, just high level about what we're going to talk about this evening.
Just one quick, Nick or Matt, can you confirm that their voice is being picked up on the video? Okay, good.
Okay.
Just I want people out there to be able to hear you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. To pick up where Greg left off, on page 2, just topics for discussion this evening. Want to talk about just the municipal market in general, just a quick overview, particularly about North Carolina. And Mr. Mayor and others, this may be a refresher. For some of y'all, it may be new, so please keep it conversational. I'm happy to answer questions along the way. Don't feel bad about cutting me off. But want to give a high-level overview of the municipal finance market, and in particular the market here in North Carolina and our options for issuing debt in North Carolina. Quick overview on credit ratings and introduce some peer comparatives, which will be helpful as we look at your existing debt profile and think about funding a CIP. Do want to look quickly back at the financial operations and general fund balance of the town. That's important. That's very important to understand you're starting from good financial footing and what kind of reserves or fund balance do you have in place as you look to take on future capital projects. That's a very important part of a CIP plan. Then we're going to look at your existing debt profile. What type of debt do you have outstanding today? And then in particular, talk about your current debt capacity and debt affordability. And these are two related but different topics. Debt capacity looks at certain key ratios compared to other peers, both in the state and nationally, but also compared to potential financial policies or debt policies that you may consider now or sometime in the future, and establish, is it reasonable to use debt as a funding tool for the CIP? Do you have capacity under those ratios to consider issuing debt as part of the CIP? Second, but related, is the affordability, which is really where the rubber hits the road. Can you pay for it? What are your cash flows like? Do you have revenues available to pay back debt service on this potential on a or multiple potential financings? And then finally, we're going to take a look at your actual CIP and what that could do within that debt capacity and debt affordability. Do you have capacity to fund the projects that are being considered? Do you have the cash flows necessary to fund those projects, or are there additional revenues or reserves needed to cash flow that CIP? Okay, so I'm going to start quickly on page 4. All right, were you able to? So we'll work on getting that up electronically shortly. Page 4, credit options. So as you consider issuing debt in North Carolina, you have a number of different options for the credit of that financing. So as an individual, as a home buyer, if I want to go out and buy a home, I could pay cash, or I could go out and get a mortgage, and that mortgage is going to pledge my house as collateral for that loan. Very similar concepts with municipal finance, but we have a few more options. The first option that we talk about is generally the best credit that you could have. Typically is going to give you the lowest possible interest rate. That's a general obligation bond. That is a bond or a loan that's secured by the full faith and credit and taxing power of the town. That means if you issue a GO bond, whether it be a bond to investors or a loan to a bank, you are covenanting, promising that you will raise taxes, whatever it takes, to fund that debt service. You are going to pay the debt service on that GO bond, no questions asked. That is certainly a viable approach. A lot of people take that approach. Again, it gives you the lowest possible interest rate. But it does take time to put a GO bond in place. It requires a vote, a referendum, and so you have to have there's a very strict process that you go through to set up that referendum. It takes about 6 months to do that, 6 to 8 months to have the actual referendum process. has to be on the ballot, be voted, and there's some steps you have to take after the vote occurs before you can go through the issuance process. So GO bonds are certainly a very good option. It does take some time on the front end to utilize that option. Another very common credit option in North Carolina is called an installment purchase contract, or in the public markets, a limited obligation bond or a certificate of participation. These are the same, different names for the same process, and it is the most similar to going out and getting a home mortgage. You are pledging an asset as collateral for a loan. And so, for example, the building we're in, the police department, when you all built this building, you borrowed money to build the building. That loan is still outstanding, and the police department is security. This actual building is security for that loan. It is, you have a mortgage on this property to secure that loan. In North Carolina, unlike other states, if you want to pledge a property as security or collateral for a financing, or you want to put a mortgage on a property, you have to be spending loan proceeds on that property. So you couldn't go out, you couldn't say, you know, we want to go out and build a park or ball fields, and we'll put a loan on the administrative building to do that. Doesn't work that way. You would have to spend money, improve the administrative building from bond proceeds in order to pull that in as collateral for a financing. Okay? Does that make sense? Revenue bonds are another option. This is a pledge of net revenues, typically of an enterprise system. So you all, not really applicable to you all, but others who have water and sewer systems, Charlotte Water issues revenue bonds secured by the net revenues of that system. It's not secured by a building, it's not secured by property, it is secured by the net revenues of that system. And last option, special obligation bonds. These are a newer credit option in North Carolina, somewhat similar to a revenue bond. It is a pledge of revenues not generated by the taxing power of the town, meaning it is a pledge of non-tax revenues that you do not have immediate control over. So, for example, for a town like yourselves, typically that's your sales tax allocation, or for others like a solid waste fee. That's not technically a tax, it is a revenue source to you all. The sales tax is a tax, but it's collected by the state, distributed to the counties, and ultimately, or collected by the counties and ultimately distributed to you all. So it is not your taxing authority, it is your share of somebody else's taxing authority. So that is an option, special obligation bonds. There are certain limitations with those about what you can spend money, what you can spend special obligation bond proceeds on, and for you all and a lot of cities, what it often entails is setting up things like a municipal service district to be able to spend money within that service district from special obligation bonds. So you have a universe of credit options, but I would say the two most common and the two most prevalent that you all would use would be, number one, the installment purchase contracts, and number two, the general obligation bonds. Special obligation bonds are certainly an option in certain circumstances where they may make sense. Those are the four main ones. There are some other tertiary credit options, I'd say, things like a special revenue bond or a tax increment financing that are really developer-driven financing options, typically to help, if municipalities choose, to help provide investment or help provide money for developers to put public infrastructure into their developments. But these are the four main options that we would be looking at for public infrastructure. Okay? Once you choose a credit option, you have a couple different mechanisms for actually issuing that debt. So let's say you chose an installment purchase contract. You had a project where you wanted to fund a ball field, let's say. You want to fund a ball field, and you want to pledge that ball field as collateral, and you choose to, and then you have a choice of how you want to issue those bonds. You could go through what's called a direct bank loan. That is working with a BB&T, Bank of, or now Pinnacle, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, any of these banks that provide direct bank loan options to you all as a town. You could take out a loan from the bank that would be evidenced by an installment purchase contract, and you would give that bank a deed of trust mortgage on, in this case, the ball fields. Advantages of a direct bank loan: typically has lower cost of issuance. It's a quicker process. It's either through an RFP or negotiating with a bank. You're working directly with the bank. There's no detailed offering documents or credit ratings required, so it can be a very streamlined process. The negative is you could be limited in the term of a borrowing. Okay, so right now what we're seeing in the markets is if you wanted to do a 5 or a 10-year loan, you would have a whole host of banks who would be interested in that financing. It could be 10, 15, 20 banks who would be interested in offering you a 10-year fixed interest rate. You go to 15 years, you might be talking about 8 to 10 banks that would be interested in looking at a 15-year loan. You go to 20 years, you're talking about a universe of maybe 4 to 6 banks that are interested in looking at that, okay? You could be, yes, sir.
So I have a question back on the previous page.
Sure.
I don't know if this would qualify or not, but we do traffic impact analysis on roads, et cetera, and I'm thinking of, for instance, the apartments. It's going to be a long time before they fix the roads. Could we take out a bond on the guarantee that they have to pay, do the improvement and pay it off with their monies as it comes in? Can you do something like that so we can get the transportation improvements more timely? Is that even possible?
I'd want to dig into the details of that and what you mean by guarantee. I think there's potentially some options that you could utilize to do that through some of these, maybe like special revenue bond type financing. But in terms of pledging a guarantee of a developer, that's probably going to be difficult. But there are mechanisms that we could look into for that, and I think we just need to get some more.
Okay. Because the frustration is they tend to do the stuff at the end, and the improvements, if we could get them going sooner, would benefit the town greatly.
Right.
So, okay, thank you. Apologize for.
Oh, no, not at all. This, like I said, please keep it conversational. So we're talking about a direct bank loan, more streamlined process, but you could be limited in the term, how far you can go out, 10, 15, or 20 years. Once you get into the 15 to 20 year range, you're dealing with a smaller universe of banks. So if one or more of those banks are not interested, then you have a difficult time getting that loan placed with a bank. One of the other difficulties could be with a bank is the type of collateral that you're pledging. So in my example, you want to finance a ball field and you want to pledge the ball fields as collateral. Some banks would be okay with that. Other banks may not be interested in lending on that financing because they're looking for, in their minds, what they call essential collateral. That is a police department, a town hall, something that says that you all are going to be likely to pay on those bonds because you don't want to lose the police department. You don't want to lose town hall. For a county, you don't want to lose a school. In their minds, ball fields may or may not be easier to walk away from for you all. And for an installment purchase contract, and I should have said this earlier, that is a loan that is subject to appropriation. So you all, as a council, have to appropriate money in your budget every year to pay that loan. Unlike a GO bond, you have to pay that bond, right? Taxing power is pledged, you got to pay the debt service. An installment purchase contract is subject to appropriation, And you all can choose as part of the budget process whether you appropriate that debt service or not. If you don't appropriate, then your mortgage kicks in and they can take over the facility. So that's why, particularly with banks, they're looking at this as some banks look for more essential collateral because they feel like that makes you less likely to non-appropriate for that loan. Okay. Another option is a public offering. So this would be a going out to the public markets and issuing bonds. Those bonds would be rated by the credit rating agencies. So under a public offering, you're going to go out, you're going to get a credit rating. You would engage a working group that would include a bond underwriter. And that bond underwriter would be tasked with going out and selling your bonds to the marketplace, insurance companies, bond funds, individual investors through your brokerage accounts. They would go out and they would sell your bonds on your behalf to these investors. In order to do that, like I said, you'd have to get a credit rating, and there's a lot more detailed documentation that has to be done. You have to put together an offering document which talks about the bonds that you're issuing. It gives some disclosure about the town, a history of the finance and economy of the town. It also discloses certain risks associated with the purchasing of those bonds and specific to you all, the purchasing of your bonds. So that public market is tends to take a little bit longer to do than a bank loan because there's more moving parts, more folks involved. It does typically have a higher cost of issuance because there's more to do for that financing, but it's a little more flexible in terms of term, how far you can go out. 20 years is no problem. I mean, in other states, folks go out 30 years for a public sale. In North Carolina, the local government commission, we typically stick to 20 years for a governmental financing. You have flexibility in terms of structuring that bond through a public sale. And depending upon the market, it may or may not produce a better or lower interest rate because you're going out to more people. You have a huge universe of people who will buy your bonds as opposed to the bank market where we've got a universe of banks that we go to. But again, the longer term you go, you're dealing with a very small universe of folks who are interested. The last option we put on here is something like a USDA financing. So that could be, you could say that's USDA, you could say that's a federal or state loan program, but that would be a governmental loan program. USDA is one of the most common. And that typically comes with a subsidized interest rate. And you can go out much longer, up to 40 years, through a USDA loan. Subsidized interest rate longer term is great. It lowers your payment. It does come with a higher total interest payback because you're dealing with a much longer term on the financing. And because you deal with governmental programs, there are certain design and procurement rules that can be very difficult to manage and in some cases can add to the cost of the project. So when evaluating a program like USDA, you need to factor all of those items in to your decision-making process. Okay? All right. I alluded to this earlier, and in North Carolina, we have the Local Government Commission. I know some of you all, is everybody familiar with the Local Government Commission? So, they have the fiscal management division, right? They're the ones who review your finances, review your audits every year. They also have a debt management division that's tasked with reviewing and approving pretty much all local government debt within the state of North Carolina. There's certain exceptions for loans under 5 years, and things like USDA loans do not fall under their purview. But almost every type of financing that you're going to do in North Carolina is going to need approval by the Local Government Commission. In order to get their approval, they have to make a series of findings. When they give their approval, they make a series of findings. And we've listed them out here for you, but essentially they have to find that the project is necessary, that you're borrowing a reasonable amount of money for the project. You're borrowing enough to fund the project, but you're not borrowing more than you need. That you have a good financial track record and you have procedures in place that will allow you to make those debt payments and maintain a healthy financial profile, that you're going to be willing to raise taxes if you have to, but that those will not be excessive, and they typically rely on you all to make that determination, and that the bonds can be marketed at a reasonable interest rate, that they're going to approve this and you're going to be able to go out and sell the bonds or find a loan for it at some sort of marketable interest rate, that you will not be going out and issuing an above market loan just because you really want to have the money right now. So they have to go through and make a series of those findings. And in order to support those findings, what they've evolved into typically is that they require construction bids and permits are in place before their approval. Typically, those have to be done 3 to 4 weeks before their approval. That allows them to say, the bond issue is necessary because you have your bids in hand, so you want to award those bids, so you need to get the money. And number two, you have bids and permits in hand, so we know the amount of the project, and so we can say that the amount you're borrowing is adequate but not excessive because we know the cost of the project. Okay? To address the debt policies and debt management, they typically look for conservative amortization structures. And what I mean by that is, for governmental projects, they typically look for a 20-year final maturity and prefer what's called a level principal amortization. That means you're paying the same amount of principal back every year, and your interest is declining over time. So your annual payment every year is going to go down. You're paying the same amount of principal. Every year you go forward, your principal balance declines, so your interest steps down, and you have a declining profile in your declining debt service profile. The other thing they like to see is a demonstrated ability to repay the project. So having a forward-looking model that says, here's how we're going to pay for it, and it's going to come from sales tax dollars or ad valorem tax dollars, and being able to show them that you can pay for that debt over the life of the project is an important part of getting their approval. And then tying into the fiscal management side, they want to be sure for any approvals after October that your audit is into them. So that's typically their audit deadline is in October. So if you have to have your audit into them by mid-October if you're going to get approval after November, which is certainly something that can play into the timing of debt issuances in sort of the latter half of the calendar year.
So the assumption is that we will have, in our current budget, have paid for the construction bids and the building permits, that we pay that prior to going to approval from the LGC.
That's right. So what happened with that requirement of bids and permits in hand, what that necessitates is you all being able to cash flow some of the preliminary costs. So to cash flow the design of ball fields or a new facility, you've got to have money on hand, whether it's in your current year budget or reserves, to be able to pay for that front-end preliminary design work, right-of-way acquisition if it involves any, or land acquisition if it involves any, and then you reimburse yourself when you do the borrowing. For once you have bids and permits in hand, then you do your borrowing and you can reimburse yourself for those prior expenditures. But it's a great point, and leading up to something I was going to mention later is that's the benefit of having fund balance, particularly when you're undertaking a CIP, is that it gives you some flexibility to cash flow those preliminary design expenses. The LGC process, typically you're going to have a meeting with them at least 2 months before you ask them for their approval. It's called a pre-application meeting. And then about a month before approval, you're going to submit your application to them, which will have all these details like the bids and permits, construction schedules in it to support their findings for approving your bond issue. Okay? And that's very unique to North Carolina. Page 7 kind of lays out some of the participants that we see in different types of financings, whether it be a public bond sale, one of those options for issuing debt, or a direct bank loan. Obviously, yourselves in the dark green town of Waxhaw, you would be the issuer, and then supporting you as an issuer, you could have any number of consultants or other entities, a financial advisor, that's ourselves, we serve as your financial advisor, and a bond counsel or a special counsel who would be a special attorney who works solely in the field of public finance. They are going to be able to help you through the documentation process for a loan, but they're also, importantly and necessarily, going to provide what's called a tax opinion. So you're going to go out and issue tax-exempt bonds. The person who's buying those bonds wants comfort from a qualified attorney that says the bonds that you're buying are tax-exempt. You are going to be able to write those off every April when you submit your tax bill. There's a number of other folks that could be involved underneath you all, and they would, like ourselves, a bond counsel, contract directly for you, work directly for you, sit on the same side of the table as you. Then there's others who would be sitting, how I would say, across the table from you. They would be entering into an arm's length transaction where they would be working with you to put the financing in place, but ultimately they have interests that may differ from yours in the final financing. That's mainly the lender or the underwriter of the bonds. So a lender of a direct bank loan, an underwriter of public bonds. We're all working together, we're all on the same team trying to accomplish the financing, but at the end of the day, there may be some interests of theirs that don't necessarily align with yours. So you do enter into an arm's length transaction with them. They also have counsel, and they typically represent, for a public sale, they would be representing the ultimate bondholders of your bonds. Then there's other third parties, like a trustee or an escrow agent, who may contract with both you and the bondholders to help make sure the process runs smoothly. We've talked a little bit about the rating agencies, and we're going to talk a little more about them shortly. But why is this? And why are rating agencies? Why would you need a credit rating, or why would a bank care about your credit? Well, just like when you go for a home mortgage and you get a credit score, that's going to help determine what interest rate your mortgage is going to be. Your credit score is directly tied to the type of interest rate a bank will offer you. Similarly, the town's credit, whether it's measured by the rating agencies or an internal credit analyst from a bank, is going to impact the type of interest rates that you all as a town receive. So when we're looking at a CIP process, when we're thinking about a debt process, we always want to keep in mind we want to make decisions that help safeguard, ensure, or strengthen the town's credit so that we can ultimately get the best financing, get the best interest rate for you all that is available at that time. A lot more details on this page, but I'm happy to go into them, but that's essentially the gist of it. And since the recession, since the Great Recession in 2008, credit quality has become much more important than it was beforehand. Before 2008, people didn't really differentiate very much between municipal loans. A municipal loan was a loan, whether it was to the state of Illinois or to the state of North Carolina. Now, since the Great Recession, we've seen difficulties with the state of Illinois, bankruptcies in Detroit, bankruptcies in California. People realize all municipal loans can be different, and we need to start differentiating between the interest rates that we provide to different municipal credits. So in today's environment, credit is much more important than it used to be before 2008. So other, what we've called other considerations, really this is leading into the second half of what Greg introduced, and it's where do you go, how do you start the capital funding process, and We understand there's options for issuing debt, but how do we get there? Well, it typically starts with the development of a multi-year capital plan. You've got to understand what projects are you going to do and when might we need to issue debt before you can even gear up the process to actually issue debt. So you develop a multi-year CIP, you have a debt capacity and a debt affordability analysis to know whether or not you can handle issuing that debt and provide the findings to the LGC that will allow them to approve your loan. If you don't have debt capacity and debt affordability, it's going to be difficult to get LGC approval, to find a bank to lend you the money, or issue bonds to the public markets. So you do some work on the front end to ensure that when you're ready to do the financing, you have all your ducks in a row and you can move forward with that. And I think that's probably a good transition into the second question in the second half of our book. And we're going to start the second half of this. Well, actually, let me stop there. Do y'all that's the high level 25-minute overview of municipal finance in North Carolina. I know I went through it kind of quickly. If there's any questions that y'all have or any follow-up items or something you'd like to dig into, we're available and happy to follow up as necessary. Okay? All right, we're going to transition into talking a little more specifically about you all, and your CIP plan, and how this all could potentially come together this year and in the future. And I'm going to start out by introducing these peer comparatives. You all are not rated. You do not have a credit rating right now. You haven't needed a credit rating because you haven't issued bonds in the public markets. That doesn't mean that you have a loan outstanding. That doesn't mean that the bank didn't do an internal credit review on you. But that just means that you haven't gone to one of the national rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and had your rating made public. When we're thinking about a CIP, when there may be a need to issue debt in the future through the public markets, we want to make sure that we're thinking about the decisions that we're making, the structure that we're doing, the borrowings that we're considering. Are those reasonable to be taking to the credit rating agencies, and are we going to maximize our credit rating through that process? Again, to minimize the interest rate that you will ultimately pay, whether that be to a bank or to bondholders in a public market sale. So one of the things that we're going to look at, because you're not rated, is we're going to look at a series of peer comparatives of other nationally rated cities, AAA, AA, and single A. And what I mean by that is, if you look on the right-hand side of the page, this is what we call the rating scale. Moody's is on the far left. Their highest rating is AAA. That's the best municipal rating that you can get. The next level is AA. That's the next highest level that you can get. And they differentiate in the AA category into three different notches, we call them. AA1, AA2, and AA3. Below that is single A, and that's differentiated A1, A2, A3. And below that is the triple B category. S&P and Fitch do the exact same rating scale. They just refer to their categories as AAA. Within the AA, their notches are AA plus, AA, and AA minus, as opposed to AA1, AA2, and AA3. So what we're going to compare you to is generically the national AAAs, the national AAs, and the national single A of all cities and towns throughout the country. And then we're going to dig in specific to North Carolina to the AAA, AA, and single A North Carolina cities and towns. And I think it's interesting as you look at your book or you look at the screen, you can kind of see who falls into what categories. And we would expect that you would fall into that AA category. You look at the towns and the cities that are in that category, and that's where we would expect you to fall, somewhere in that AA category. It's just a question of, is it AA1, AA2, or AA3? Okay? So, but we're going to use these peer comparatives to make sure we're thinking about that along the way when we're looking at your existing debt and potential new debt, as well as fund balance. A little bit of information on the rating agencies and what they find important here. And I think this is, you can read through this and see the actual calculations that they do, or the detailed categories that they do. But I think the important thing to take away here is there are essentially 4 key categories that Moody's and S&P both look at when rating you: economy and tax base, finances, management, and debt. You have budget decisions that you make today can have a direct impact on 3 of those categories. Finances, which is mostly deals with fund balance and fund balance trends. Management, which is putting procedures, policies in place, as well as maintaining a balanced budget. And debt, maintaining an adequate, reasonable debt load. All 3 of those, you all can make decisions that impact that here in the short term. Economy and tax base represents 30% of the rating process. And that's not something that you can change in this year's budget process. You can make decisions to encourage development, to try and get the right kind of jobs in town that will raise your median family income, that will add to your tax base, that will create jobs. You can put policies in place, zoning in place to help encourage that, but you're not going to make a decision today that's going to impact that tomorrow. That's more of a long-term item. So what we say about that is understanding that 30% of your rating is almost out of your short-term control. We should make sure we're doing what we can on the other 70% to check the right boxes and maximize our opportunities. And so that's what we're going to focus on today: fund balance and debt in particular. And along the way, we're going to talk about some ways that may be helpful in the management aspect of that. Okay. All right. So first, I alluded to this earlier. I'm going to talk about your general fund and your general fund balance. We've modeled up your historical financial operations over the last 4 years, and what I would say is you all are in good shape from a historical financial perspective. You've managed yourself well. Operationally, your operating revenues versus operating expenditures, that's line 28. Your annual revenues have exceeded your annual expenditures every year, your annual ongoing expenditures. The one thing that you have done historically is you've transferred some money to capital project funds and set aside for future capital projects, which does show you drawing down some fund balance in 14, 15, and 16. But a lot of that was for one-time capital projects, and some of that money is still set aside for future capital projects. So when we look at this, we say you've managed yourself well financially over the last few years, and you've been able to move some money to capital project funds, planning for future projects. A little more detailed on 15, and this is getting into that general fund balance. You all have an adopted fund balance policy stating that you will maintain unassigned general fund balance equal to 6 months or 50% of the operating budget. That's a great policy. I mean, that is a very good policy, higher than what we see in other places. And you all have been pretty much able to comply with that policy over the years. You have come down a little bit on your unassigned, that bottom bucket of your fund balance. Unassigned is the absolute rainy day bottom bucket fund that you have available to spend on anything you want. And typically, you want to maintain that rainy day fund at some minimum balance. You all, as a percent of expenditures on that rainy day fund, that's, if you're looking at this chart on the right, that's that dark green line. You all were right around 35% on your unassigned fund balance at the end of 17. That's a very good level. That's a very good level to be at. And it may be something where you want to think about revising your policy going forward. 50% is a very high target to be at. You could certainly come down on that target and still be very good in the rating agencies and investors' eyes, but it may allow you to have some flexibility as you move forward with the capital plan to use some of those fund balance dollars to cash flow some preliminary expenses. So if desired, that's something that we would be happy to work with staff and look into that fund balance policy and providing some information for considerations there.
What do you typically see, or what's more the norm? You kind of alluded to that we're high.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Everywhere is a little different. Every situation is unique. What are your, depends on your level of operating budget, right? So, smaller operating budgets tend to have a higher percentage fund balance policy, right? City of Charlotte may be at 12% or 10% fund balance policy, but that's tens of hundreds of millions of dollars. 10% fund balance for you would be about $1 million. Well, in case of an emergency, that $1 million might not cover you very far. Major accident happens in Waxhaw, it's going to cost the same thing as if it happens in Charlotte. It just will. And so you have to have some amount of dollars to be able to manage unforeseen circumstances. So it's hard to say across the board what is everybody at. But I think, somewhere, where you are right now at 35%, that's a very good level. And I would just want to do a little more research before coming back to you. And I think that's something that we could work on, if desired. But put it into a little more perspective here. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Commissioner Lee, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, I thought it.
Sorry, I was just getting out of my line of sight, so I can focus.
To put that into perspective, and this may help with your question a little bit, Mayor, we have done some peer comparatives on fund balance. And so this is the first peer comparative we're going to introduce. It's on page 16. The graphs on the top are graphing dollars, total fund balance, a category that we call rating agency fund balance. This is the way Moody's calculates their fund balance. And it is done based upon, it includes the stabilization by state statute dollars. So that's specific to Moody's. That's how they calculate it. That's a dollar amount on the top. And then on the far right, we've got your unassigned fund balance, that bottom bucket rainy day fund. Dollars on top. And the bottom charts, as I alluded to earlier, it depends on your budget size. We have converted that as a percent of revenues to adjust for the budget. And so if I look at the far right-hand side of this page, total unassigned fund balance, Waxhaw is in the gold bar up top. The light green bars are the national AAA, the national AA, and the national single A. The dark green bars are the North Carolina AAA, the North Carolina AA, and the North Carolina single A. And what you see is your dollars, you kind of fall between that AA and single A median within North Carolina. But when you look at the graph directly below it, as a percent of your budget, at that roughly 35%, you're slightly above, right on top, all of those medians. So, you are in very good shape. And remember, these medians represent the midpoint of the data. So half of the data is higher than this median, half of the data is lower. So you're right on top of the median, you're right in the middle of this range of rated cities and towns. So in very good shape. Okay. Questions? I know you all have a meeting tonight, so I'm trying to get through this. If I'm going too quickly, please stop me. If I'm going too slow, speed me up. But that kind of covers fund balance, and I think you're starting from a good position with fund balance. You've built up a nice fund balance over the years. It's provided you opportunities in the past, and I think it will provide you opportunities going forward as you look at a CIP. But certainly, you've got good historical financial operations, and you've got good fund balance, it's reasonable from that perspective, it's reasonable for you all to be considering looking at investing in and funding capital projects going forward. Okay. Can talk a little bit about your existing debt. You have one loan outstanding. It is that installment financing for this building. So you got a mortgage on this building, one loan, and it is a level debt service transaction. So we talked earlier about the LGC preferring that level principal approach. One reason or another, we were not working with you at the time. You were able to do a level debt service transaction. That means that over the next 12 or so years through fiscal year 2029, you're essentially going to be paying $526,000 a year towards this building. After that, in fiscal year 2029, steps down a little bit, and then you're paid off at that point in time. So you all, from an existing debt perspective, have the one loan, and it's a level payment going forward. So your debt service will not be declining. You're not going to have to increase your budget appropriation. You're going to be making the same budget appropriation every year going forward for this loan. On the right-hand side of the page, we're going to introduce the far right. It says 10-year payout. This is the first key debt ratio that we're going to introduce for you all today. And what this 10-year payout ratio measures is how much of the principal amount of debt outstanding, so in this case the $5.2 million, how much of that $5.2 million are you repaying over the first 10 years of that loan amortization? So over the next 10 years, how much of the $5.2 million are you repaying? You're repaying roughly 85%. That means you're taking care of it. You're not deferring that principal. You're not deferring paying off your obligations. You're stepping up, you're paying it, and you're paying it down quickly. 85% is a very good payout ratio level, and you get a little bit of perspective on that on page 19. When we look at that peer comparative on the top right, this is all about the payout ratio. When we look at that peer comparative on the top right, you all are right in line with all the national and North Carolina medians for this. What I'll say is this is a debt ratio that tends to fluctuate depending upon where you are in the capital funding process. Folks who have just recently invested in capital tend to have a slightly lower payout ratio. Think about it, if you do a 20-year level principal financing, so you do a 20-year loan, you're paying back the same amount of principal every year, you're going to have a 50% 10-year payout ratio in that first year. You're going to repay 50% of your debt over the next 10 years. So inevitably, as you look to take on new debt, the 10-year payout ratio is going to come down some, but then it'll normalize and start to grow from there. So, but you're starting from a good place here on the 10-year payout, right in line with all the medians. Kind of, you know, like you have a fund balance policy that you may or may not want to revisit, you may want to consider some potential debt policies, particularly as you're looking to adopt and fund a CIP. Having debt policies in place do a couple of different things. Number one, they address that management component of the rating agency discussion that we talked about earlier. But it also provides sort of a target or an absolute minimum level or maximum level that says we're not going to go below or above this. We are going to take on some debt, but we're setting parameters for ourselves, and when we take on debt, we're going to do it in a responsible fashion. That's can be beneficial for a number of different levels, not just the rating agencies. So that may be something that you want to consider as you move forward with a potential CIP and funding process. You may want to consider some debt policies, and this is one, the 10-year payout ratio is one that we would recommend considering for a policy. This would be a policy, a minimum policy level, so no lower than somewhere in the 50 to 60% range is a typical policy level for a 10-year payout ratio. We do have on all these pages, we do have some what we call rating agency considerations. What do the rating agencies say about this? Moody's, on their 10-year payout ratio, they're okay with it unless it's what they call unusually slow, that could be a negative, or unusually rapid, that could be a positive. They don't get very specific. S&P says, we're going to give you a positive check mark if you're above 65%. Okay? Just a little bit of perspective on that. Obviously, you're well above the 65% right now. The next key ratio on page 20, debt to assessed value. This is a measure of your debt outstanding as a percent of your tax base. And you all, the roughly 5.2 million on the 1.8 billion tax base, are right at 0.3% debt to assessed value. It's a very good level. You see that in the peer comparatives. You're below all of these medians with the exception of the North Carolina single A. And again, rating agency considerations in the bottom right. Moody's gets pretty specific on this. Anything less than 0.75% debt to assessed value is in their highest category. You all at 0.3% are well below that 0.75%, in very good shape. This is another ratio where we typically recommend policies if you're going to consider debt policies. And typically it would be a not to exceed maximum debt to assessed value somewhere in the 2 to 3% range is a typical target, somewhere in there. When setting debt policies, it's important to look at where you are today, but it's also important to think about what are our needs coming up and how is my debt profile, how are these ratios going to change over time if I fund some of my capital needs through debt. So we're going to circle back to these discussions, but want to give you that perspective on this existing debt. Okay? Last one of these, debt service to expenditures. This is measuring your annual debt service payment as a percent of your ongoing governmental fund budget. I say ongoing, we're backing out capital expenses in this instance. So we are truly focused on ongoing operating budget that we can try to project out in the future. And we've used, in all of these, we've used a 1% growth rate, which I think is conservative based upon where you've been historically in recent years. But use that 1% growth rate for expenditures here. So your annual debt service, that $526,000 on roughly $9.5 million of an adjusted expenditure budget is about 5.5%. Easy math. It's about 5.5%. You can see from a median perspective, you're in very good shape, lower than all these medians, again, with the exception of the North Carolina AAA. And S&P says anything less than 8% is in their strongest category. So you're, again, falling into that strongest category for S&P. You could consider looking at a debt policy for this. This is the last one that we typically recommend debt policies on. And typically we see this in around 15%, maybe 15 to 20% range on the higher end. But that would be a typical policy level if you were to consider a debt policy for this. Again, we'd want to understand how your future CIP impacts this. And this ratio, debt service to expenditures, kind of goes hand in hand with that 10-year payout ratio. Debt service to expenditures is driven by your annual debt service payment. Well, what's the easiest way to lower your annual debt service payment? To stretch out your debt or to defer your debt, right? Well, that's where the 10-year payout ratio comes in, because it's going to limit your ability to stretch out the debt or defer your principal on your debt. So when considering these policies, they all kind of work hand in hand with one another. All that said, all these ratios, we would say you have debt capacity. It's very reasonable for you all to be considering debt as a tool, as part of funding your capital plans. You're in good shape with your existing debt profile. You have debt capacity. The other side of the question, as I talked about earlier, is affordability. What do your cash flows look like? What revenues do you have available within your current budget to pay for new debt service or new capital projects? And that's what we start to address on page 22. And I know these are small numbers. I apologize, but if I could, just take a second to walk you through this page because I think it's going to be helpful as we go forward and think about the impacts of potential new projects. So we've done all of this in column A by fiscal year, starting with fiscal year 2018. And we've layered in your existing debt service in column B. That's the debt on this building, $526 a year through 2028. Column C is a placeholder for future CIP debt service. As we look to fund a capital program, if there's a debt component of that, we're going to drop in the debt service in this column. Similarly, column D is that CIP pay-as-you-go capital. That's where we would drop in your annual cash-funded capital from a CIP. So we're going to capture the debt and the pay-as-you-go capital side of a CIP in this model. Column E is a placeholder for the CIP operating impact. So think about it this way. We're focused on, at least for right now, the bricks and mortar or the dirt and grass, if you will, of a field or of a park. But just because you graded and built out a field, or just because you built a park or a new police building, it doesn't end there. Then you have to go on operating it, and that can come with additional costs. So what we tend to focus on in this affordability analysis is, better said, capital or debt affordability. It's the cost of the capital project and paying for that capital cost over time. We can certainly discuss or layer in an operating impact, but to keep things simple, we've talked about capital for right now. We leave a placeholder for the operating side, though, because it is an important consideration for you all when making decisions. We want to make sure we are aware and are thinking about there could be operating impacts associated with capital that we undertake. Okay? So we total all that up in column F. We call that our total requirement. We call it total debt service requirements, but maybe better said, total capital funding requirements in column F. Then the question is, what revenues do you have in your current budget to pay for your current capital requirements, and what revenues may be available in the future? So we start with column G, your general fund budgeted debt service. In your annual budget, you're appropriating $526,000 a year to pay for the loan on this facility. The assumption that we've made is those are dollars that are within your current budget that you'll be able to make available every year going forward. And when this facility pays off in fiscal year 2029, we're still assuming that you can roll that $526,000, continue to roll that through your budget, and make it available for future debt service or future capital expenditures. It's a way that you're kind of locking in that specific amount of funding for the capital program. It's not going to get pulled over into the operations side. Similarly, column H, general fund budgeted for pay-as-you-go cash. So in FY18, you all have about $650,000 in your general fund budget for transfers or capital expenditures. $350,000 is for the transfer to the Waxhaw Fields project fund. This is your third year. You've done that for 3 years in a row. This is the final year. And so that's built in to your FY18 budget, as well as $300,000 for the Nesbitt Pago Park project. Okay? Again, like the debt, the assumption is that $650,000 is built into your budget this year, FY18. As you begin to budget for next year for FY19, you're not going to have the Nesbitt Park Pago, you're not going to have the $350,000 transfer, but the assumption is you're still going to make that $650,000 available for pay-as-you-go capital or debt service to help begin funding the CIP or a future capital. Does that make sense? So we're locking in that 18 funding amount so that as your debt pays off, as you end your current PAYGO obligations, those dollars remain available for debt service and capital. So we total all that up in column J. That's in FY18, that's $1.176 million. compared to our total requirements here that we're showing 826,000, that leaves us with the 350,000 surplus. That's what's going to be transferred to the Waxhaw fields. So you're basically break even in FY18. But you can see column K, that annual surplus deficit, it becomes column J versus column F, that's $650,000 a year until the police department pays off, and then it starts stepping up after that. So that is affordability that you have within your existing budget to be considering for capital expenditures or debt service. And that's what we're going to use as our baseline. One other thing to point out, column P on the far right-hand side of the page, this column P includes prior funds that have been set aside for the Waxhaw Fields PAYGO project. So you're starting with that $350,000 that you've set aside every year. You've spent some of that down already on preliminary costs, but we're starting that with that as a balance in our capital reserve. And the assumption is going to be that of that $650,000 next year, if you don't spend it on capital next year, you're going to allow it to fall to a capital reserve fund to be available for future capital. You're truly isolating your a capital funding budget at this point in our model is the assumption. And this is going to be the baseline for our affordability when looking at the capital plan. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So now the question is, you've got debt capacity, you've got affordability. Is that enough to do what you want with it within the CIP, or do we need to look at additional revenue sources to help supplement? Okay? So on page 24, this is the CIP that I think you all looked at your retreat. We've just summarized it and dropped it in here for you all. It's over over prior years to date, and then 19 through 2022. It's a total of $32.5 million. A lot of that is already funded. And I think staff walked you through that already. If you look at column C, the funded category, all the Fs are already funded. And then you've got the PFs, which are partially funded, and then the NFs, which are not funded. Okay? That's what we worked with Greg and Lisa on. We've taken the PFs and the NFs and said, that's what we need to focus on when looking at our debt affordability and our debt capacity. Look at how do we fund those unfunded projects and what does that do to us. So we've isolated those on the following page, on page 25. And in particular, where we end up is looking at debt issuance over the next 4 to 5 years in total, could be in total $26.1 million if you funded all of those unfunded projects. And that would be done over a number of years, 19 through 2022. It is sort of spread out. You've got a couple projects that are shown in 2019. I'm going to talk about those for a second. That's in particular the Waxhaw Fields, which you've been setting aside some money for. So you'll notice if we're looking at the Waxhaw Fields line 2, we've got the debt issuance amount of $2.79 million, and the total project's $3.7 million. You're not having to debt fund that entire project because you've set some money aside for that. The other 2019 project that you could potentially have is the public services facility. And so when you think back to what we talked about, funding options, and we talked about an installment financing contract, which is the most likely used for a project this year, you get into the idea of essentiality of collateral with Waxhaw Fields. That's a park project. It's essentially raw land at this point in time. It will be graded and turned into fields. But that, I think there's banks out there that would be interested in Waxhaw Fields as collateral, and there's banks that wouldn't be. So it would be great if the timing works out, if you choose to move forward with both of these projects, if we could do them at the same time, and you actually get a building with the public services facility as part of that collateral package.
Just a question. On page 24, number 13 is the Waxhaw Marvin Park property. Yes? That could also be on the next page, could it not? Potential projects that you're talking about on page 25?
Yes.
I know we don't have an estimate
Yeah,
listed
that was,
here, but
that was sort of to be determined. Same thing with the downtown park improvements as to be determined. We took the amounts that we had, dollar amounts for,
Gotcha.
and sort of planning amounts for, and rolled that onto page 25. But if there are, if that becomes more clear about the year, the timing, the amount of that project, we could certainly roll that in.
okay,
Okay?
thank you.
But right now, we're focusing on these projects that we had dollar amount estimates for. And so we're going to look at a couple of cases for funding these various projects, the $26.1 million over 2019 through 2022. I'll note that we do have this to be determined placeholder for future projects out there, 5 million, 5 million, 5 million. I think that is where some of those park projects could fall into in the future. But those are really just placeholders at this point for potential projects. And so what we've done, particularly with that in mind, that there's some to be determined projects out there, is we've looked at a series of cases. And we started by just funding the identified 2019 projects of the Waxhaw Fields and the Public Services Facility. Let's understand how those specific projects that could happen next year impact you. And then we've looked at funding what we've called the identified capital projects, and I'm on page 26 now. We've looked at funding what we call the identified projects in the years identified, excluding future projects. That means only the projects 1 through 5 on page 25 that have real projects and real dollar amounts assigned to them. We haven't funded that 15 million of to be determined projects. And then we move on to start layering in the 5 million each of the to be determined projects. We do 5 million in case 3, an additional 5 million, total of 10 million in case 4, and 15 million in case 5. We've also run a separate series of cases that look at funding your maximum debt funding capacity for fiscal years 19 through 23. In all of these cases, we've assumed the 20-year level principal amortization structure. That level principal amortization structure being very conservative, what the LGC wants to see. 20 years, I'd say, is maybe a little more on the aggressive side. We talked about from the bank perspective, there's probably a handful, 4 to 6 banks out there that are going 20 years right now. So it would be something that, if we wanted to shorten it to 15 years to find more bank interest, that would impact these numbers some. But we wanted to keep it simple, 20-year level principal financing, and see the results of this case, okay? This series of cases. So we've got a summary for you here on page 27 of the results. All the details for each of these cases are in the back of the book. It's very similar to what I walked through with your existing debt. So if you have questions, you want to see how those models are working, it's in the back. We can flip to it now, or you can peruse at your leisure. But I think what you care about, at least initially, is what is the results of this case. So let me walk you through case 1 starting out. We're funding in 2019 the Waxhaw Fields and the Public Services Facility. That's $3.9 million of debt that we would be funding in fiscal 19. 20-year, 5% level principal amortization structure. That's going to give you a total payback of on the 3.9, a total payback of $5.9 million. We tracked your debt ratios, so those key debt ratios that we walked through. We tracked those. Your 10-year payout ratio comes down from what was like 89%. It comes down to about 72%. Still a very healthy level, no problem with that level. Debt to assessed value goes up from what was 0.3% up to 0.5%. Still very good level, no issues there. Debt service to expenditures does increase, goes up to about 9%. Still very healthy. still almost in that very best top category that you could be from the rate agency.
Did you model in any additional operating expenses?
Kept the same 1%,
Okay.
1% growth rate, no additional growth in the operating budget. Okay, and then we also ran it through the debt affordability model, just the capital funding component, like Mr. Mayor, you alluded to, just the capital funding component, no operations, just the capital funding component through the capital affordability model, and you can fund these 3.9 million of projects from your existing budget resources. No additional revenues required to cash flow these projects. So what you all may be considering in 2019 does not have any impact on your budget if you're able to lock in that FY18 line. Go to case 2.
Does that assume we revise the general fund policy to 35% as well?
This does not pull in any general fund balance dollars.
Okay.
It leaves that where it is. We haven't touched those general fund balance dollars for these calculations.
Okay.
The capital reserve fund, the
Right.
monies that you have set aside over time, and it's going to use your annual pay-as-you-go capital, $650,000.
Okay.
That starts getting applied to the debt payment. Okay, case 2 is we're layering in those other identified projects. So we're funding the 19 projects. We add in the sidewalk improvements in 2020. We add in downtown streetscape in 2021 and Waxhaw Parkway out in 2022. Increases our debt to 11.1 million of debt issued. Total debt service goes up to 16.7 million based upon that 20-year level principal amortization structure. Our ratios go up, as you would expect, ratio more debt, but we still stay at healthy levels. 62% payout, 0.76% debt to assessed value, 14% debt service to expenditures. That starts moving up a little towards the higher side, but still very reasonable for you all at this point in time. Affordability side of things, we got to come up with some additional dollars. In order to cash flow the debt service, we would have to come up with the equivalent of 1.02 pennies in fiscal year 2025 and an additional 0.69, 0.7 pennies in 2026 for a total equivalent of 1.7 pennies. Now that may be new pennies, that may be pennies within your existing budget if you can find it anywhere, cutting expenses if you can find it, but it's the equivalent of 1.7 pennies on the tax rate that you would have to come up with. Alternatively, if you had other reserves or other revenues equal to $1.1 million, you could avoid those equivalent tax rate impacts. So you got to come up with that 1.02 pennies, 0.7 pennies, 25 and 26, or find $1.1 million over this period of time. That's 1.1 million is the total shortfall through this period of time associated with that debt. Does that make sense? Okay, you start adding on. Case 3, you add $5 million of projects. Debt service to expenditures gets on the higher side, 17.8%. We're above sort of a 15% magic number, but not dangerously above it at the 17.8%. It's on the higher end, but it's not completely unreasonable. What you see is you need more dollars sooner because we're doing more debt. So you need the equivalent, essentially the equivalent of 4.65 pennies in fiscal year 2023 to fund the identified projects plus $5 million. So a total of 4.65 pennies in 2023, or the equivalent of 5.3 million of reserves. Okay. Case 4, we add another 5 million, so we're at 10 million. You see the impacts to your debt ratios, your debt service to expenditures gets over that 21% mark. So now it's on the higher end at this point. Your debt affordability, you got to come up with essentially the equivalent of 7.2 pennies in 22 or 23, or 11.3 million of reserves. So, the reserves at one point, maybe case two, may be reasonable to find over that period of time. We're starting to creep up on the higher end. We're really talking about got to find that equivalent tax rate to really be able to cash flow. Same thing, you add another 5 million, 15 million, debt service to expenditures gets up to the 24% level, or a total of about equivalent of 9.7 pennies, or 18.2 million of reserves. So I think what we see is, and we alluded to this, you have debt capacity. Certainly, case 1, 2, even 3 certainly have debt capacity. Even getting into case 4, you still have capacity. You still have capacity, you're just on the higher end of some of those ratios. Affordability, case 1, you've got it. Case 2 is you're getting into y'all's decision-making about what's affordable, what's not affordable, and whether you can come up with those pennies, whether it be new pennies or alternative pennies, or could find reserves to cover 1.1 million. Then I think you start getting into, particularly 3, 4, and 5, you really get into having to find some pennies to be able to make a cash flow. Equivalent pennies, again, whether it's new pennies or old pennies, finding those equivalent pennies to do it. Quickly, case 28 just says a little bit of perspective. On this page, I think you focus on lines 1 through 8, and really it's lines 4 through 8. We're assuming that you're going to fund the 2019 projects. Waxhaw Field, Public Services Facility, that's lines 2 and 3. Lines 4 through 8, we've calculated by fiscal year. If you maximized your debt issuance capacity within your cash flows, how much debt could you issue in any given fiscal year? These aren't cumulative. These are, once you issue it, you're done for a while. So case A, fiscal 19, you could do 4.1 million under those cash flows without needing any additional reserves, without needing any additional equivalent pennies. You could fund 4.1 million on top of Waxhaw Fields and the Public Services Facility. Case B, you go out 2020, it's 4.5 million before you got to start coming up with additional dollars. You can see 2021, it's 5.1, 2022, it's about 6 million, 2023, if you waited out until 2023 to do everything, you got about 7 million that you could fund within your current cash flows. And then we've got all the details you want in the back of that. But that's really, I think, what we wanted to cover tonight. And please jump in here, Greg. But I think wanted to give you that perspective on the CIP as y'all have been looking at it, both identified projects and future projects, and then a little bit generic capacity of what you could fund if you couldn't or didn't want to find any additional dollars on top of your current budget.
The important thing to remember about page 28 is in the case B, C, D, or E, that's a one-time shot. So once you made that decision in any of those years to fund the 4.5, the 5.1, the 5.9, it's one and done. So it is not cumulative.
Yeah, it's so. For example, case C. If you were to do case C, you waited until 2021 to do $5.1 million of debt. You're going to use all of your cash flows available to you through 2029. So if you had other projects you wanted to do between now and 2029, on top of Waxhaw Fields, Public Services, and that $5.17 million in 2021, anything on top of that through fiscal year 2029 is going to have to find other reserves or other equivalent pennies to be able to cash flow those. So as we were looking at this, I think good news is you have debt capacity, you have debt affordability, and you can begin funding your identified projects within your CIP. And then we've hopefully given you some perspective about what those future projects could mean to you as you consider this. And I'll stop now. Any questions I know that's a lot of information that we just walked through. So as you think about it, process, have follow-up questions, please. We're always available to Greg and Lisa, happy to follow up with any additional information. Just let us know.
So the unknowns in here are things like Highway 16 or right-of-way, things like that, where we would have to go and come up with capital on things like the unknowns, if you will. So this just covers the knowns. That's all I'm getting at. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, this covers the knowns that you're planning for. There may be opportunities that arise, or there may be items that arise that you have to address. But planning for the knowns, I guess.
Yeah, and just what kind of buffer do you keep in there for the opportunities, as you call it?
I think that also leads into a discussion through the budget process of these are knowns. In addition to what we do know today, there are other projects that will be identified in the next 2 to 5 year window. And they include things like what the Waxhaw Marvin corridor study says to us. And so there will be absolutely projects that will pop up as part of that study that will need some sort of funding or strategy. So these are the bigger projects that we know of today that generally are $1 million projects plus, but there will be smaller projects that will need to be addressed, and then there will certainly be opportunities, and that opportunity might be a piece of land that comes available that would be needed for future town usage, whatever that use might be. So if there's a piece of property that comes on the market, do you have funds in and above your fund balance policy to take advantage of it? Certainly anything that is above and beyond the fund balance policy, we would want to structure into another, what I would call an opportunity reserve fund, and there are different terminologies for how you set that up, but basically anything above the 50% or the 35%, it's set aside for capital or for debt service. And so that'd be the first pot that you look at if for instance, a piece of property came on the market and it was something that would be appropriate for the town to try to address. The other part of that, though, really is back to what Mitch was talking about. You've got to have project planning funds, and that may be surveying, it may be design engineering funds, but you have to have some period of time to spin up a project in order to really take it to the financing step. And sometimes that spin up engineering and planning process is 3 or more years. Potentially with a road project like Waxhaw Parkway, we're back to the 5 to 6 year model, because you're dealing with all those factors that we've talked about before with the DOT, whether it's right-of-way, utilities, the environmental part of it, all those steps that you have to go through there are back in play on road projects. So it's not a two-year window, it's a 5 year window before you start talking about putting something out for construction. The model, as Mitch has showed it, has a lot of flexibility in it, and you can look at the projects that we know next year are going to be looked at in the budget that's brought to you in May. We know that given the current time frame for the fields, the Waxhaw fields, the fields on Kensington, that to get those into a bid process this year, we'll need some additional funds once we go to construction. So we've got to think through the issuance of those dollars. And the second part of that too is, as we continue to look for suitable locations for public services, as Mitch referenced, if we can tag those two together, that's the best approach for installment purchase finance approach. As we move into the project development for some of our other projects, you saw that we have in there some placeholders, and that's because for various reasons we don't know exactly what the comprehensive redo of the park and rec plan will say for the 2 parks that we're talking about. We don't know in an out year what an administrative facility would look like. So we didn't make assumptions and say we're putting some dollar figure with any of those 3 projects, because even though this says draft, it will stick in people's mind that we've assigned $1 million figure to a particular piece of property or to a particular facility. And we wanted the board to have maximum flexibility going forward to get the information, to gather information, go through the process, go through the redo and the updating of the comp plan for Parks and Rec, and look at those projects without staff putting some arbitrary number down and saying, we think it's this. We don't think it's anything in particular. We think you need flexibility. So we simply programmed a third of 15 million in 3 out years, and we can move those dollar figures around as we move forward and get more certainty as to what those projects look like. But I think the framework is here to understand it's going to take multi-years to spin up multiple projects to get them to that bid phase. So depending on what's in a park or what's in a project, those amenities, may be basic, or it may include a lot of infrastructure. We know on some of our facilities we're going to have to make sewer line extensions, so there's roads and sewers and all that. Luckily, well, not luckily, but one of our facilities, we own most of the property there. Another facility, we may need to acquire more property. So there's considerations there that would come into the project planning time frame.
Curiosity question, how much contingency is built into these numbers? We're in a high growth area, and given that we're a smaller town, we tend to get higher bids.
Sure. I think that is a fair warning that construction costs right now are still running 30% to 40% higher than what they should be. And the smaller the construction budget, the more at risk you are for that volatility. So if you're building a $15 million facility, then you're getting a lot of more bidders and they're being more aggressive. But if you're building something in the $1, $2, $3 million range, you could only have 2 or 3 bidders show up for the initial meeting. So that is something to be concerned about. Over the life of this window that we're talking about, absolutely expect to see that we expect some correction in the construction market in that things will slow down and get tighter, but it has not right now.
Questions, comments? Good stuff.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
It's going to be a fun budget cycle.
Let me just talk about next steps. So this is not going to be a surprise when you see it in the discussion of the budget and the CIP, because I think you've seen it now in January, you've seen it again. This essentially is not going to change between now and May as far as projects that we're talking about. The 2 that are imminent are the fields and public facilities. If we can come up with a plan to move that forward, we absolutely know that that's a need, and we need to have that. That number for public facilities absolutely is not set in stone in any way, shape, or form, because until you have dirt and start looking at design and facility size, it's almost a placeholder too. So to the mayor's point, depending on what we find, that number could change. Same thing with the park. Until we get bids in hand, we are using an engineer's estimate, and they have adjusted that estimate up over time, but it's still an estimate.
Another question for you. So you said there, for the general obligations, it's a 6 to 8 month process, so we could never be ready this year. But you also suggested that we should take a look at our policies. How quickly should we do that, and is that a flag to anybody if you're suddenly changing your policies and then submitting an application? I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, so I think, number one, you don't have any debt policies right now. So you'll be instituting a series of debt policies, which would be a positive for anybody looking at you, the rating agencies or banks or anyone. That's going to be a positive, is instituting those debt policies. I think from a fund balance policy perspective, I agree. It's never a great thing to change your policy, but you've also had that policy for a while, and you've learned, but you've also been growing quickly, right? So you're different today than you were 5 years ago, right? Than you were 10 years ago before that. So you kind of grow and evolve, and if you stick with 50%, that's great. That's a great policy. I had no problem with that. But if you want to go a little bit lower, maybe more reflective of your current budget levels and where you might be headed in the foreseeable or near future, you're starting from a really strong policy going to a very strong policy. So I think that mitigates some of the potential changes in your policy. If you went from 50% to 15%, then I think let's revisit the conversation about whether I would suggest you would want to even consider.
Yes, and we get some phone calls.
Right, but so you're starting from a position of strength, and it's all relative and individual as to how big of a red flag is it going to be, and is it really going to be an issue at all? For you all at 50% going, as long as you go to a very strong policy level, I don't think it's going to be a major issue.
Okay. Thank you.
One option that we will look at is whether it's a single-digit numerical number of 35%, 40%, or whether it's a range. And there is some precedent and opportunity to use a range, and that it gives you flexibility inter-year to, maybe you slide under 35% and you're at 33, but by the end of the year or first quarter, you're back up to 35. So that's something that we would look at as well. Not to say that that's what we would necessarily recommend, but that we'd certainly look at that as an option. From a timing standpoint, if a GO referendum is to be set in calendar year 2019, which would be our next opportunity, there are decisions that have to be made basically by February of 2019 to initiate that process and take votes that get it on the ballot for the fall. So think about that as just as not an arbitrary date, but a pretty hard date. That we have calendars that exist already that we know in February of 19 we'd have to be coming to you. You'd have to be thinking about the sizing of the issuance, or the sizing of the referendum questions would be the better way to say it. The questions themselves. So what categories would you put on the ballot, and then what sizing amounts would you associate with those questions? For example, the question would have something to do, for instance, would you support GO referendum in the amount of X million dollars for parks and recreation and associated facilities to include blank, blank, and blank. It would not call out a particular park. It would call out parks and recreation facilities and trails and greenways and the associated things that go with it. Same thing with transportation. If the bond question or referendum question was, do you support transportation improvements and enhancements, it would state on town roads and on DOT roads, so that you'd have the flexibility to participate in either project. And it would have sidewalks and bridges and overpasses and all the things that are associated with roads, but it typically does not include specific examples of roads. Why is that? Well, the bond council is going to tell you one real reason for it is that if you put it on the ballot, then you've got to deliver on that project, number one. Number two, if you put it on the ballot and you try to associate it with a project, you have just tied your hands, and if other people's money come to the table, which can happen, particularly at the DOT level, you have no flexibility. So you might be able to find some CRTPO funds that would come to a project, maybe a direct attributable type fund that would come to a town project that would free up our money to either enhance that project, expand that project, or find another suitable project in the town that would be eligible. So if you have that referendum authority, you'd want to have, under the heading of transportation, some latitude in how to deliver that, because you could have a developer that builds part of a facility for you, and you're able to take the town dollars and marry those dollars up with somebody else's project, whether it's developer or state DOT. So that's the flexibility that you really want to think about, that you're providing if you put something on the referendum. Now, from a education and policy standpoint, what typically happens is the local elected body says, this is the group of projects that we're thinking about funding, and here are the years that we're thinking about funding them, and they tie back to a very solid case for how that would work, but there is no absolute promise that it's going to be just exactly like that occurs. The other thing that you can do is that depending on the economy, you may decide in year number 3 or 4 that you can't issue the debt. So you may push it back a year. Well, that helps the model, but it's also changed the model. GO bonds, GO referendums, you have 7 years to go out and issue the debt. There is a 3-year extension that you can go to the LGC, and depending on your reasoning and rationale, you can get a 3-year extension, so you could have up to 10 years to issue debt that's authorized, but it's typically a 7-year window.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why, as Greg talks about, how you want to structure the questions, you know, it's certainly up to you all. You have the option to say, we're going to do it for X project, not for Parks and Recs or transportation, but you really do limit your flexibility in doing that. And it's a 7-year initial authorization plus an additional 3 years. I mean, think about what's changed over the last 10 years in town and what's going to change over the next 10 years. So having that flexibility allows you to evolve with the referendum and do what you need to do at the time that it's ready to go.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
And I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the
Motion
work
to
session. So moved. All those in favor?
Aye.
See you in 20 minutes.